Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Josh. Lovely to be on.
So before we get into all that good stuff, I'd like to just start with a quick intro to your journey on how you sort of got into the specialism of football finance and how your sort of journey's come about.
Yeah, I guess like many of your listeners, failed sportsman professionally, as is always the story. So failed footballer, failed cricketer. I was slightly better at cricket than I was at football, but yeah, never made it. And then always wanted to go to university, but I'd never got a chance to study the kind of business aspect as much because it was always PE or business at my choices at school or A level, and naturally you lean towards PE at the time. So went to study sport business management as an undergraduate student at Sheffield Hallam. So to coin the football analogy again, I'm kind of a product of the system in many ways because I did my undergraduate degree there, master's degree in sport business, and then was fortunate enough to go on to a PhD scholarship with the research centre. Now that was in the area of sport finance, but it was kind of open book in terms of what I could look at. So decided to bridge that into the football finance world. And around the time I was also doing some teaching content, was shadowing sessions, was looking at what others did in kind of a more of a lecturer scope, getting involved in some student marketing, etc. So yeah, long story short, I then when I did the PhD, went on to deliver all the finance content on a sport business program at Sheffield Hallam, moved internally to the business school a few years ago to get my chartered accountancy status, but have always been kind of teaching, research and applied consultancy, external engagement in the space of the economics and finance of professional team sports. So that's been a kind of career theme that's run through it. But yeah, I guess as a starting off point, it was failed professional, and I've managed to stay in the game, for want of a better term, in a slightly different way. So yeah, it's been hugely fun, and I get to do a loads of work with the media as well as a result of that, given the way sport finance has exploded contemporary as well. So all those things that I do kind of in the classroom, embedded through the applied research, and then out into the industry.
No, that's brilliant. It sort of echoes sort of my own experience in terms of failed sportsman, gone into realizing I might not be good enough on the pitch, but behind the scenes, I definitely have something to offer. And then, like I say, yeah, it's really interesting. I think it's one of those things that people may not even realize that is like a career in the area of sort of research around football finances, but it's an industry in itself. It's one of the largest, not one of the largest industries, but it's one of the more complex industries in sort of the UK at the moment, with the growth of regulation, with the sort of the international aspects of it. It's a really interesting space, especially off the back of the fan led review and everything like that. It's a really booming space at the minute. You obviously mentioned that you've the economics of sports teams and all the rest of it, which is a really interesting subject. Obviously, I read your book on that, which was a really good read. What do you sort of see as the sort of state of the game at the moment? Are we obviously we're going to a new way with a new independent regulator? Do we think this is necessary? Do you think this is the right way forward? Why now? Why do you think it's necessary or not?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think the why now, if we start with that, there are a few things at the minute that have become really pertinent over the last few years, and of course we can't ignore the politics of it. So there's a few kind of, I guess, extra fuel that's been put on the fire in recent years. The European Super League is the ultimate one kind of within the industry. If we look back to that failed attempt 4 years ago now, I think, wasn't it? So we probably don't realize how long ago that was, but that was certainly something that the regulator and the fan-led review grabbed hold on from the outgo. Also the situation at Bury FC, the demise of Bury in 2019, and that piece around ownership. But it was a little bit political as well around that time, that the Boris Johnson and the Conservative government, there were wider factors there where perhaps government had not really wanted to get involved too much in sport, but have always seen football in particular as a way to kind of adhere themselves to voters, as on many other policies. So there were a few things, I guess, externally that have happened over the last few years. And certainly within the industry, European Super League and the ownership piece was front and centre. And to answer your first part of that question in terms of is it needed, myself and a lot of other people that work in this space have said similar things. Ultimately, it shouldn't be. Is the consensus, certainly for me. I don't think we should be needing an independent regulator, but here we are, and that kind of stems through some of those issues that we're talking about. And I guess if you look at that through the lens of governance for a moment, part of the reason we are where we are is because the Premier League effectively breaking away in 1992, ironically a breakaway Super League looking back, but we didn't know that at the time. And stepping away from that, then the Football League and those two organisations now operating during that time period as independent governing bodies, we've seen some of that disconnect and some of the financial considerations, and of course we'll talk about financial gap between those leagues. That has only grown throughout the last 30 years to points where some of these individual clubs are now unsustainable because they're perhaps chasing ambitions that are just not achievable given the finances. So there's all those kind of things in the mix, but principally we're looking at a governance issue of those two leagues not being able to ultimately agree a deal that everybody perceives to be beneficial for the wider environment, and partly that's why we are where we are with the independent regulator. And one thing I've always gone back to with the research, and a lot of good colleagues around me who have been involved in that and people that I've worked with on that kind of broader economics and governance level, we talk about this collective action versus vested self-interest. And that's the football governance piece in a nutshell. We think that because the sport economics nature and that joint nature of production, that people should be acting for the collective, but ultimately they act in self-interest. And I guess that's partly why we are where we are with the regulator as well.
Apologies for taking you away from the podcast, but this will be really quick. We've launched our football business community. What that is everyone that's a guest on this podcast is part of this community. So if you would like to network with our guests, this is the place to do so. We have a live Q&A with every podcast guest on, so you can ask your questions rather than just listening to mine. If it's something that sounds interesting to you, there's a discount code in the description below. Use it, click the link, join the community. Right, that's all from me. Let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, it's a really interesting space. I mean, obviously, so my background, obviously, I used to work at the EFL and Club Financial Reporting, so it's my job to sort of enforce these regulations. And one of the things that makes sort of football governance so difficult is the range of stakeholders that are involved. So obviously, so I'll take you back to obviously when we introduced salary cap for League One and League Two. So we were at salary cost management protocol. Sorry, I'm going into, for those who are listening who are probably all over this, so it's fine to go into this sort of detail. So we had salary cost management protocol, SCMP. We then introduced salary cap for League One and League Two, which got voted through, which is a miracle for one, because again, this is in order to get regulatory change, the EFL will, write up some regulations, we'll put it to the clubs to vote on. If we can get the clubs to vote it through, which is brilliant, great, we get it through. But then you have the PFA, which is sort of like the players, and they go, actually, a salary cap, that doesn't sound like fun for football players. Like, we don't want to be capped on our salaries. So obviously Deloitte worked with the PFA, and then obviously that gets overturned, and we go back to SCMP. Obviously, we're in a position now, we're going to squad cost ratio, which is a whole new thing, but well, it's actually not that different to SCMP. It's much different to profitability and sustainability rules, which is what you see in the Premier League and Championship, but it's not a million miles away from SCMP, which is currently what's in League One and League Two. So that was a bit of a tangent. My point, the point was on that, it's just that this, in order for regulations in the current system, in the current government bodies, to put forward regulations for then the clubs to vote on it. It's sort of like turkeys voting for Christmas in terms of when, especially when you've got stuff like owners and directors tests. Like, why would a football owner want to make their asset more difficult to sell when they want to sell it? Like, they're not going to want more regulations around that. So it's very difficult to get stuff voted through. And then even when it is voted through, then there's scrutiny of all the other sort of supporting, ecosystem around it, then has also influence on the regulations. So having an independent regulator that can sort of state rules and sort of make those wider judgments that's good for the game, I only think is a really big step forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And you alluded to a couple of examples there that I've used time and time again. The stakeholder piece is really key to that. And the salary cap thing in League One and League Two is a prime example. And again, I don't think many people know that actually was close to being in play. It's only if you kind of really following these things. And that would have been a huge step change. But ultimately, as you say, the PFA voted that out. And again, just on a wider sort of sport economics governance piece there, I think that's where there is no perfect solution, and perhaps there never will be, and we're often striving for that because we're looking at a salary cap as a principle, and they have that in American sports, and we're looking at American sports and go, oh, we should be doing a little bit of that, or we should be looking at this German model of, you know, the way they run their clubs. But you can't, if you look at salary caps as an example, the American sports have had them from day one, and everybody signed up to them. The leagues are run very differently. They're franchise operations. They're there to make money for their owners ultimately, but they've been in from day one, and they've always been adhered to. And the player care within that financially is built in. There's welfare things built into it. There's collective bargaining agreements. And we look at trying to then put a salary cap into a sport that is 150 years old plus in this country, and it's never going to work is my view on it. So you then arrive at, as I say, the kind of, so what's your best version of something that's always going to be imperfect? And I'm with you. I think having been close to the inner workings of profit and sustainability, the SCMP in League One and League Two, various talks about whether or not there should or should not be a salary cap, and whether that's a number or a percentage of is another consideration. Should it be a fixed number or should it be a percentage of turnover, things like that. I think the squad cost rule that's likely to come in, which of course is what UEFA have already moved to, I think that is a better version of what we had before, but it's not perfect because the biggest clubs will still win out, and the ones that are well set will be better positioned to capitalise on that ratio because 70% of their turnover on player cost is more than 70% of a club that's maybe a league below or even 4 or 5 places behind them. So that's the unintended consequence piece of regulation. And in many ways, it's always going to be anti-competitive to some, and we have to be aware of that. But again, I agree with you. Then if you roll that through onto the regulator, and there are certain things that the regulator, I think, can be really beneficial in time. And even if that's on a really granular level, that it allows us to look at the owners and directors piece in more detail. So it enables us to not let people in the door that perhaps shouldn't be in the door, or it enables us to get people out of the door when they're in. So those legal powers that the regulator will have, I think, are going to be quite important. But also the regulator won't solve all the problems, and the financial distribution and the backstop piece there and everything that comes with it will continue to dominate the landscape. And I think there is this kind of, almost like understanding now that it's going to land somewhere in the middle, but we have to try and get more things right with it than leaving things up in the air. And one big thing that's wrapped up within that at the minute is the financial resources that are behind the regulator. And you know, that even Martin Henderson himself, I've listened to him speak a number of times, and you know, comes across really well and wants to get stuck into this, but he's almost been putting little words in there about, you know, you don't want an underfunded regulator as well. And I think that's a really important piece within this, is that, as you say, we've never had one before. We've never seen the likes of this before. It does feel like the game's in a pivotal moment for a whole manner of things, and the positives could far outweigh the negatives in the future, or the pros will outweigh the cons. But there's still some question marks at the minute that you've almost now got to chase that down. And I think that's where I would be positioning this at the minute, is let's chase down the positives and let's make it as good as it can be, given we know that it's never going to be perfect.
No, I agree. It's slightly this whole new independent regulator is a slightly new way for government to sort of get involved in football, because obviously the sort of major involvement they had previously was sort of like the Taylor report and the differences that they made to sort of stadium safety and all the rest of it. And looking back on that was a really positive thing for the industry, actually. And not many people say government involvement is a positive when they talk about different industries, but for football, actually what they brought in with the Taylor report has really helped with sort of like the safety and everything of fans. So that's been really positive. Bringing in a new independent regulator to actually oversee, again, it's the independence of that. How independent can the independent regulator be? You have all those questions. The other thing around, you mentioned UEFA, which is really interesting, because at the moment, the way in which the regulations really work is UEFA set the regulations. The Premier League have to align with UEFA because almost half the clubs are competing in UEFA competition. So they have to align, because you can't be passing one and failing the other. Then the Championship have to align with the Premier League because of the relationship and the agreement between the EFL and the Premier League. So that's why you see profitability and sustainability in Premier League and Championship. And then sort of League One and League Two, the EFL are sort of allowed to do what they want, essentially. And that's why they have a salary cost management protocol. So, no, I think I'd just love to get your thoughts on just like that in sort of general.
Yeah, it's something, again, I've always gone back to is the inconsistencies in regulation across the ecosystem is a challenge. And I completely agree with your point there, Josh, about, how independent, is anything truly ever independent? Probably not, again, which is why we're working on the version of, what's the best version of it. And we've had this in football, haven't we? It's like, who polices the police? So you've got UEFA, you've got FIFA, but FIFA are never going to set regulatory frameworks across, on that kind of cross level, because they've got different confederations that all work slightly differently, and there's nobody above FIFA, really. So, yeah, UEFA have dictated the regulatory landscape in Europe, and then you've got the Premier League underneath that and other leagues in Europe, because some, of course, don't have profit and sustainability regs at all. Some have various versions of parachute payments or similar, but others don't. So it's never a one size fits all. But if you focus that back in on English football, as you say, you've got the challenge then of, right, so if you're a club, how do you approach that as a club? So if you are, and you can see this in a lot of clubs' annual reports, actually, not to get too kind of granular in the detail, but a lot of those clubs will say, Championship as an example, you'll get some Championship clubs that say the club is regulated by the FA, the EFL, the Premier League, UEFA and FIFA, and they have to conform to those regulations. And some of those clubs are nowhere near getting into Europe, but they are putting on their list of people they have to, conform to against regulation. And you can look at that then from a really practical lens and go, well, how do you compete? And I guess perhaps might talk about a couple of examples there in how that plays out. So let's bring in the National League as well, because there's absolutely no regulation in the National League. And you and I are talking at a time where we've just seen Wrexham gain promotion to the Championship. And if you look at a club's journey, and it's an overwhelmingly positive growth trajectory, Wrexham have come out of the National League where there's been absolutely no regulation at all. And Stockport did the same, losing £4-5 million a year, those clubs, to get out of the National League. They've had to look at SCMP in League One and League Two, but it's never been enforced by penalty. It's been a collective agreement that clubs have adhered to, but we've not seen points deductions for clubs breaking it, as an example. So they've had to ride that wave a little bit, but now they've got a different thing to consider, because now they're into the Championship, and now we've got profit and sustainability regs in the Championship, which limits £39 million cumulative loss over 3 years, and then the Premier League version is 105 million, and no doubt they're aiming at the Premier League. So each club has to find a way to navigate through that, but all the while, and we can look at other examples in the past on a different level. Wolves went up a few years ago, double promotion, I think it was, or promotion to the Premier League, but then they got straight into Europe. And UEFA settled with them for £600,000, 600,000 euros out of court, because they'd broken UEFA's regs. But their Wolves argument was, well, we never expected in our wildest business plan dreams to get into Europe in the first year. So, but it does highlight, again, the challenge with regulation, because you move through divisions and you move into competitions, and you have to conform with slightly different bits of regulation. So I think, again, kind of fast forward that, and you alluded to it earlier, I think a positive, not perfect, but a positive moving forward will be, we expect the Premier League to move to squad cost within a year. They've been pretty vocal about that. The EFL are saying similar, and are pretty vocal about that. So if that's going to align with UEFA's version, that's a good change for me, because now you've got UEFA, Premier League, EFL going, right, the numbers might be different because of the finances involved, but we're just making that slightly more consistent, and every club then kind of can navigate within that accordingly to a degree.
Yeah, I think the point about the National League is really interesting. So obviously, how sort of SEMP works, it's not just a revenue percentage. It's essentially what you have. Without getting too granular, but I'll go a little bit granular. You got two aspects of income. You got relevant turnover and football fortune income, and these are what basically, if you add them together, you get a percentage of your relevant turnover, and you're allowed 100% of your football fortune income. You add them together, and that basically tells you how much you can spend on player-related expenditure. Um, for people may not know this, but for when you basically go up from the National League to the EFL, you have to re-sign all your players. So the players' contracts for professional player contracts, again for people listening to it, will probably like the granules. So it's 13A is the name of the form for a professional player's contract. You have to re-sign your current squad, and a lot of the clubs who are coming up from the National League are having. Well, my job was literally to ring up the owners and be like, look, just to re-sign your current players, you've got a 1 million. You're going to have to put in £1 million plus tomorrow in order just to re-sign these players. So the good thing about salary cost management protocol is the fact that it's live monitoring. It's like you cannot register the player if you're not within the remit. So it's a case of there's never going to be a penalty essentially for SCMP because the fact that if you weren't in line with it, you wouldn't have been able to sign the player. So you sort of can't breach it, which is obviously the sort of a really good way of enforcement. But yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of change in the National League. One of the concerns that people have when it comes to additional regulation is, will football clubs sort of become more locked in position because they don't have the freedom to have sort of mass financial influx, especially if they're looking to sell and get additional sort of investment into the club? Do we think that's a positive? Do you think that's a negative? What are your thoughts on this sort of, is tighter regulation going to should clubs be worried about being locked in position because of the fact that they can't use a lot of additional funding to just help them push through the divisions like Wrexham have?
Yeah, I think they are worried about it, and that goes all the way to the very top. And we've seen Aston Villa and Newcastle as two examples be very vocal about the fact that they feel like they're being stifled to a degree because they've got owners that are wealthy, and Newcastle United is wealth beyond wealth, but they can't spend it because of the profit and sustainability regulations. So you can look at that through two lenses, and I think a lot of some of the research that I've been involved in, particularly around the European level. So we published some stuff around the unintended consequence of financial fair play as an example. And FFP is not the single causal factor for sure. There are other things: ownership, broadcasting revenues, distribution of attendances. There's loads of things that go into the mix. But FFP is certainly one component that is serving to bake in this hierarchy that's already there as well. And there's plenty of other evidence that from other people that would support that to a degree as well. And that for me is that unintended consequence of regulation. And if you look at the theory behind that, it will talk about one of the things is kind of cementing the competitive order and preventing competitors from catching up, because you're saying, right, even if you've got the wealthiest investors in the world, there's only so much you can do, and then those clubs that are already there are well set. So I think it's a concern for me, put it that way, whether or not people see it as that. And again, we go back to that collective action, vested self-interest. If you're in that group that's okay, you're probably saying it's not a concern. But if you're in that club that's trying to catch up, it's probably a viable concern for sure. And to some extent, I mean, we can look at this in a number of different ways, and there's kind of loads of examples we can point to here. To some degree, I think we're already there with a competitive order. I just don't think we want to talk about it as openly as perhaps we should be. And that kind of again stretches out into Europe. I think Bayern Munich have just won the title again in Germany. They've only not won the title once in the last 12 or 13 years. The dominance of PSG in France. The Premier League is more competitive than its counterparts in Europe. The EFL as a collective is more competitive generally than the Premier League, but that's on a league level over a number of years in time. I think if you're looking at individual clubs, and I guess the Championship is a great example of this. How does a club that is either newly promoted to the Championship or kind of established in the Championship, how do they compete with profit and sustainability regulations, an owner that might not have the deepest pockets, and clubs with parachute payments, because the broadcasting gap between Championship and Premier League is 100 million minimum? It's a really tricky question. So I think it's a valid concern, and I think we've already kind of got, to a degree, a hierarchy in English football. I just don't think it's perhaps, we don't want to go there and really sort of look at it too much, because of the fact that it can happen. So the Leicester story, the Wrexham story that we're seeing now, they're brilliant, but other clubs will look at that and go, well, that's okay, but we haven't got a Hollywood owner, so how do we do it? And actually, we might be overstretching to then try and do it, which might put us at risk of our own sustainability. So I think a lot of this comes down to ownership and owner motives, and that can change in an instant overnight, because a club can be sold or taken over or have to be bought out for a number of reasons, and the whole thing can change. So I think the more I've kind of seen of it, I think if you look at an individual club level, it becomes about owners and owner motives. But the regulatory piece in general is back to that point around, we have to accept that in some ways there's unintended consequence of regulation, and that is one of them, in terms of not everybody's going to be able to get to the top of the Premier League, as we're talking at the minute.
No, I completely agree. I think it's going to become more difficult, and that's where clubs have to continue to innovate. And I think you can see, obviously, with the Wrexham story, it's easy for people to, but like externally, to look at just the money that the owners put in, which was considerable, but also the amount of income that came into the clubs through their storytelling, through the Welcome to Wrexham, through the sponsors that then generated for the football club. Like the amount of revenue that football club generated for the division they were in is
in League Two.
Phenomenal. So it shows that they leverage the fame of the ownership in order to do that, but it does show that there are unlocks, there are ways in which you can drastically reshape the financial structure of your football club if you can be innovative. And it's the same, we look at, a lot of people look at sort of the Brentford Brighton story of taking data analytics to a completely new level when it comes to recruitment, and having a player trading model that just is churning out ridiculous amounts of net profit, because of the fact that they've been able to identify these undervalued assets. And it's terrible to sort of categorize that, but these undervalued players, bring them in, show their talents, and sort of develop the skills as and where they need, and then sell on to massive profits.
Absolutely. And one thing I'll be clear on there as well, is I'm not knocking any of that. I think there are absolutely ways, and I think the other question we should perhaps ask, which again is not the most sexiest question, is what is success like for each individual club? Because that's going to be very different. And as you say, we can talk about numerous examples about innovation and ways to do things differently, and we should be leveraging that for clubs where they can. And the Wrexham story is the turnover's unbelievable. £26 million in League Two. The average in that league is normally about 4 million per year, and that will outstrip some Championship clubs and the two levels below. But they've leveraged that, and fair play to them. And then you other ways in which you look at this, and people will always talk about Brighton and Brentford and those innovative methods as well. But financially, with those two, there are other sides to that story as well. And Brighton, owe a huge amount to one individual, Tony Bloom, who is probably into that. I think the biggest numbers I saw was, in and around the tune of 400 million, that kind of level of investment. And he's had to now convert some of that to equity as a response to the associated party transactions case with Manchester City. And Brentford is an example of, a brilliant model to follow for growth, innovation, different strategy with Matthew Benham and Smart Odds, and the background to that there's a couple of books that people can read. If you've not read them, brilliant, go and take a look. The data behind it's brilliant. But if you look at their wages to turnover ratio before they got promoted, for 2 or 3 seasons they were 150% kind of levels. So even then, even on that innovative level, they've had to overstretch. to try and get to the Premier League. And I think again that's still part of the challenge in the Championship in particular. And I think that what's happened here is people have talked about, you know, the Championship and looked at it in the same way that you play a roulette table. It's like you've got a 3-year gamble and it's all on red for year one, and it's all on red again, and then it's all on red. And at some point, you know, it might come off and you land that gamble. But the reward now financially is almost so great that it's promoting the gamble. And I think we have seen a number of examples there as well. So yeah, there's loads of, again, it becomes very, I guess what I'm trying to say there as well with those 3 examples, Wrexham, Brighton, Brentford, they're all very different individual cases as well. They're all trying to do something, which ultimately was to progress the clubs through the league. And a lot of other clubs are trying to do that and would love to do that. But they've done it very differently, linked to their owners, their background, the innovation stuff as well. So yeah, I guess the challenge is you're all trying to do the same things, but there's only so many ways you can do it. And then the ownership piece over the top of that is what's driving the strategy ultimately.
I think it's the risk and reward element is really interesting. 100%. I mean, people talk about sort of the sort of funding throughout the pyramid and how that can influence the risk and reward. The other sort of side to that coin is because it all depends on owner motives as well. So when you look at, if you're purely driven by on-pitch performance, you're going to be taking those risks. So if this is your toy, quote unquote, if you've got millions and millions of pounds, you just want to see your club lift a trophy, like you're not looking at it from because everyone talks about the financial jump, and again, there needs to be better distribution, but it's not like you get to the Premier League and it's all magic and all of a sudden you start making loads of money. It's just like they're hemorrhaging massive losses as well. So it's not like you get to this point of, oh, if I get this extra money and now I'm going to be sustainable, if I get this extra, it's like, it's a constant, because of how competitive the industry is obviously naturally, any money that you have, in order to compete, you're almost having to completely spend it fully out the door anyway. So how much of an impact do you see redistribution having on financial sustainability, or is it something that it doesn't, or almost doesn't have any impact if it isn't hand in hand with regulation that restricts what you can do with that additional funding?
The latter point there is really important, isn't it? Because and again, we can look at countless examples and countless scenarios. If we're just banging the drum for redistribution and that is on an income basis alone, and you say, right, great, so we'll sign this deal, Premier League and EFL agree the percentage, and that deal means there's an extra £4-5 million to each League One club, as an example. If you just give them that 5 million with no other stipulation, there's a high likelihood that some of them just spend that on players and wages. Some of them will invest it in multiple ways. They might buy a couple of new players. They might look at infrastructure. We're back to that kind of good investment versus player investment, aren't we? Which is what FFP does as well in terms of the things you can claw back. But I'm with you. I think what that needs to be in time is, if that were going to happen, is it has to be backed up by regulation on the sustainability piece, because so we almost need to be ring fencing it, saying, right, we're going to give you this extra money, but it's got to be spent on this, this, and this, and you can only spend X on this, etc., etc. Because which is where I think squad cost rule can help in the future as well along that journey. But I'm with you. I think there is a high likelihood if you just make it an income distribution and with no stipulation, clubs will just spend that on players and wages. But so, and the other thing over the top of that, that I think is kind of in addition to, is we are starting to see clubs, you mentioned Premier League as well there, and you're absolutely right, there are some clubs that get there and it's then a real financial challenge to even stay there, and before you've even talked about being competitive. And again, we've seen the narrative this season, bottom 3 come back straight back down. 2 of the 3 that have gone up so far from the Championship, Burnley 1 year, Leeds have been out a couple of years. If Sheffield United go up through the playoffs, that'll be return visit. So we know the challenges are there. What we are starting to see clubs do as well, even without the kind of squad cost rule being fully in place or a salary cap, is bringing wage reduction clauses and wage bonuses in contracts, doing that off their own back. And not every club is doing that still. I think they should be, for the record. I think it's just solid business sense in the climate that football is in. And if you're going to look at the gap between leagues, and we talk about redistribution's a challenge, and the wage to income gap is a challenge, the way you can navigate that as a club is to go, right, so if we get promoted, then your contract can stipulate a player bonus. And if you get relegated, then there's a wage reduction clause. Now, again, the stakeholder piece then comes into play. And I've spoken to players, agents, that kind of world as well. And the clubs where they go, we get that, but that means we can't compete because the player then doesn't want to sign the contract. And so you're back to that stakeholder piece of, right, that would be really good for club sustainability, but it's not going to chime with getting the players in through the door that you want. And that stakeholder piece then becomes really important. So, yeah, I think, look, if we're going to have better distribution, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it needs to come with some consideration on cost. And I think wage reduction and wage bonuses can go some way to negating that anyway, but I appreciate that stuff in the player transfer market.
No, I agree. And I think the other issue that has to be sort of looked at is, I mean, at the moment, we're sort of looking at, when we talk about the relegation clauses and stuff, some clubs do it, some clubs don't. And therefore, the clubs that do sometimes miss out on players who end up going to the clubs that don't. But even if that becomes more of a sort of a standardized thing that all clubs have to enforce, then it doesn't really solve the issue, because we can't enforce those rules globally. And this is a global game, right? If you're going to sign for, I don't know, if it Leeds, let's say, for next season, and they don't have a relegation clause if they're coming back down, or you could go sign for a Bundesliga club who don't have that clause, who are in a similar position. If they're offering similar wages, then you're more likely to go, well, at least even if it doesn't work out at the club, I'm still going to get my money. So, the sort of competitive balance is going to be, a really interesting, and it has been the argument throughout this whole thing. The argument from the Premier League is, is this regulation going to put us at a disadvantage when competing nationally, especially when you see leagues such as the Saudi Premier League now sort of taking off, and seeing more and more sort of players go that way. How do you sort of see this playing out? Do you think we'll get, with the new independent regulator, how do you think we'll get to a point where it's massively like strong regulations from the get-go, or do you see this as sort of like light touch? But if it is light touch, will it actually have any impact, and is there any point in it? Like, where do you sort of see it going?
Yeah, I think that's probably back to like the marginal gains point, isn't it? In the early phases, it's not going to just come in overnight and change the system. There's going to be, and it's not even fully in place yet, is it? The Premier League have been running a shadow stuff in the background in terms of squad cost themselves. There's going to be a shadow regulator before a full regulator. We're talking, in my head, it's always been like, whenever we even really start the process, we're probably 3-5 year transition period, I think, until we start to see what it shapes up like. And then I think on the hot topics, I guess, and the fan engagement bit is another part of this, which is important. And I think protecting, the stuff around there that it can do really quickly, like protecting the club badge, changing kit colours, those kind of things. Club can't sell the stadium, or club can't rename the stadium. All of those things, which all have financial considerations as well. But those things it can come in and it can do pretty quickly, because that's a good thing, right? Protect the club heritage. What it can't do quickly is some of the other stuff. And, it's also always come out and said that the regulator will be the ultimate backstop in the financial distribution piece. So there comes a question point there when that backstop is maybe hit or needed, doesn't there? So if the Premier League and the Football League can thrash out a deal, and we might be in a position, hypothetically, where they have thrashed out a deal before the regulator even takes power. So that one's done for a few years. So then it doesn't need to do anything in backstop terms then, because that's done and it'll come round again in 5 years. So I think there are pockets of it where you might see some pretty quick movement, but there are other pockets where it will just be in the background, and it's almost like as it's being positioned in some ways, that kind of ultimate backstop. So it can make a bit of ground on the owners and directors test as well. That'll shape up. But it's you're talking about a huge governance piece, aren't you? You alluded to it earlier. I mean, we've never seen it before in English football, not to this level. So getting that governance piece right is going to take time. So I don't think it's going to be right, bang, day one, kind of here we go. And all the while, the clubs will be looking to react to that in their own ways as well. So there's a lot of unknowns there at the minute, and I get the argument the Premier League are making that it might be detrimental to the Premier League brand, and I get why they would say that. I don't subscribe to that view. I think the Premier League brand is strong enough to cope with that and will continue to do so. But it does throw a few little curveballs in here and there about owners, the motives, how it kind of interfaces with the rest of the European game at a time where other leagues in Europe are doing their best to try and catch the Premier League in different ways, being innovative, doing things slightly differently. So that's going to be an interesting piece. But I think, for me, I think we're almost like now talking, right, what's it going to look like in 3 to 5 years? And it can't just be what it looks like next season, because it's just not going to happen that quickly.
Yeah. Well, in terms of, obviously, we sort of circle around the idea, and there's a lot of discussion of sort of around sustainability, which I think is it's an interesting word, because almost like every club has its own definition, and so it's a case of like, I think it's really one of the key things that sort of like the independent regulator needs to do when it comes in is actually have really key, like, clear objectives as to what it's trying to achieve, because it's very difficult, because at the moment, there's sort of 8 objectives of like the current regulations, and none of which talks about sort of competitive balance. That's not even an objective of the current regulations. It's not even a stated objective. Like, it's mainly around like trying to get clubs to operate on the basis of their own revenues, looking after the sustainability of league football. But what do you think, like, the point of the regulator should be? I know it sounds like a really daft question, but what is it aiming to, like, what should it be aiming to do?
Yeah,
does that make
absolutely.
sense?
No, 100%. And I've asked this question and have spoken on panels related to this at numerous events, and we're all asking similar questions. Go back to that 3 to 5 year thing. There's a question about what does success look like for the regulator in 3 to 5 years, and I haven't seen an answer to that, if I'm being honest. You can sort of see, as you say, like where it's aiming at, but there's a lot going on. So it's a good question, isn't it? And I can't answer it right now, and thankfully it's not my job to answer it at the minute. But what does success look like for the regulator? And I guess you and I started off with this conversation about why it's here, and people will talk about, they'll go to examples and they'll go, well, it's to stop a Bury, or it's to stop the Super League. But it needs to be more than that in time. And I don't think it's pretty clear on what the success measures are, which to me links back to your previous question there, in that in the way you position this about what does sustainability mean? Because you and I, and given your background and experience and my background, we'd probably be on a similar page with what that means, because through the jobs that we've done and the way we think and the way we operate, we're positioning that in a certain way that means the club's ultimately sustainable without the owner. Ultimately, the club needs to be self-sustainable, because owners come and go and clubs are forever. So we look at that through a lens of kind of pure financial sustainability, which is the club can prop itself up. But you're absolutely right. You could throw that word out into the industry at every single club, and they go, well, our definition of sustainability is not that. Because the counterpiece to that is, well, if we've got an owner and that owner is sticking around and they're prepared to fund the losses, we're sustainable. And there's so many clubs in the English Football League system that we could put that on as a kind of badge of sustainability. They're not ultimately, because they're reliant on one person, but we're then separating the club owner and all the things that come with it. There's a whole range of clubs that would say we're sustainable, but they're ultimately reliant on one person. So I haven't got the answer to that, unfortunately, but I think the two things there that I would absolutely is spot on in the way we're talking is, what does sustainability mean for each individual club? What does sustainability mean in general terms? And also, if we're going to measure this regulator against something in time, if we cast our mind forward 5 years and go, what are the KPIs, the success measures that we want from the regulator? And I don't think the royal we, are quite there yet. And it's a big task. And I said it, I don't envy some of the people there. It's a brilliant job to get stuck into, but it's a huge task. And we've got to look at, what are the measurables and what do we expect it to do, and the outputs that it might generate from that.
Well, no, I couldn't agree more. It's a really interesting time for the industry, and I think whatever happens, whatever change comes of about the independent regulator, making sure. I mean, it's a different point that we probably don't have time to discuss in detail. But in terms of like support for clubs during all this, because this is a whole nother thing in terms of reporting, resource. How does it impact their day to day? So what? If you we'll come to sort of like finish off today. What would you, if you had sort of some I know we just talked about specific definitions for different clubs, but like what are the things that you think football could be doing better? If you were going to say, right, these are like 3 things that football clubs need to be looking at to be generally more sustainable, what would be your sort of like 3 pieces of advice that you would sort of put forward?
I knew you were going to ask this question last off after we've just had that really difficult conversation about sustainability and success. I think, and you'll know this world better than I will, Josh, but I think you're absolutely spot on the support for clubs is one thing I would focus in on, and because this is going to be a whole different level of reporting and how it kind of looks moving forward. So I think anything we can do to support clubs to be more sustainable in the generalist sense of the word, what's there, whether that's support with, business planning, and football's so short term, isn't it? But let's try, and if we're going to build in some more resource, can we support them to look into the longer term and ultimately that level of sustainability away from one person in the future? That's not to say that person needs to go, but how do we make the club be more sustainable when that person leaves? And a lot of good club owners will talk about themselves as the custodians of the club, not the owner. So that's one piece, the support. I think the innovation piece is important to consider as well. How do we get them to grow outside of their traditional accepted norms of bums on seats in a physical stadium, broadcasting, which is largely at someone else's mercy anyway, and commercial contracts? A better piece on fan engagement for the clubs to look at, how they engage better with not just their local fan base, but their international fan base and that reach around the world that a lot of them have got. How do they start to look at that and get to know their fans better? It sounds a bit weird, that, but I don't think a number of football clubs really know their fans that well. A lot of them are names on a database that will buy tickets. How do you engage better with them? And the third point will unfortunately always come back to cost control in the sport as well, and given where it's at. So I think in aligning those pieces around how can we make them become better, more sustainable in whatever definition we're looking at, how do we get them to diversify and grow income and engage better with their fans as a result of some of that stuff as well, and also how do we get them to look at that through the lens of cost as well. And I think that's not saying that all those 3 things, if you get those right, it will work, because they'll still be. The jeopardy piece is always the play with English football as well. There are only 3 teams that can go up and 3 will go down. There's only so many trophies you can win, so you've still got that in the background. But yeah, I think there's some really tough hitting questions about what do we mean by sustainable, what is it club by club, and actually how does that play out over the next few years? Because on top of those 3 things, and there's loads of others that we spoke about, you called it earlier, and I'm completely with you. It feels like we're in a bit of a pivotal moment for English football, certainly on the men's side of things, but also on the women's side of things as well, as a sport that's in growth mode but needs to harness some of that potential. And I mentioned the Premier League earlier. We didn't know at the time how big the Premier League was going to get, and we look back now, and hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? But just with a lot that's going on in the industry, broadcasting rights, governance challenges, independent regulator, Super League or not Super League, Champions League being ultimately a new Super League de facto anyway, there's loads of things, ownership, there's loads of things that feel like a bit of a melting pot. And I think it's a pivotal moment for the game in the next few years. And you and I could sit here in 30 years' time and go, wow, that was a moment. and I think it's the awareness point on that is not lost on me at the minute. So there's no silver bullet, but I think there's a few things there that, again, with the regulator, I go back to that point about let's try and put more value on the positives and let's make it the best version of what it can be, and all the other things around it I would put in a similar way. Let's try and focus on the positives.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolutely brilliant chat, great insights. And for those who would like to ask their own question, anyone's listened and got this far, congratulations. Listening to two accountants talk about finance for an hour is good going, so congratulations. If you want to have your own questions asked, we are hosting a live Q&A with myself and Dan where you can put your own questions forward and engage and sort of network with us directly. There'll be a link in the below for that. Thanks again, Dan, and yeah, thank you very much.
Lovely. Thanks, Josh. Really enjoyed that.